Most people don't really know how Bitcoin works. A lot of these Bitcoin maxis have been just DCAing for forever, which is great. But they've not really used Bitcoin. They buy on a centralized exchange and they send to a wallet they self-custody, which is great. But they don't actually use Bitcoin. And because of that, they're pretty unfamiliar with the idiosyncrasies of like how the Bitcoin gets from A to B.
Welcome to Beyond the Beat, a podcast by Chain Story, the agency to elevate your status in crypto. I'm your host, Pedro, and every week I'll be talking to the people in crypto media. We'll be telling their stories, their failures, their lessons, and whatever tips or tricks they've got up their sleeves.
So let's get going. Charlie from Blockspace Media, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, for sure. Co-founder of Blockspace Media. I'd never imagined that I would be back in media. My original career path was actually working for National Public Radio in central Oklahoma. So 15 years ago, Pedro, I was originally pursuing a career in like local news broadcasting. Then I spent 15 years in energy and Bitcoin, and I'm back in media. So
why'd you get interested in media in the first place?
that's what my natural inclinations were. In college, I did one of like local like college closed like CTV like programs. I hosted it. I was interviewing people just at the studio at the college, and then the local NPR affiliate broadcast out of the room next door, and I started working for them over the summer, and I ran the local news beat. I did a lot of like local city council news in my hometown. Yeah.
Was that like feel good stories, or were you covering?
Boring as hell. Oh man.
So it is as boring as I think it must have been.
Bitcoin, crypto stuff is so much more interesting. It's chaos every single day. But at the local news scale, it's just obscure things nobody cares about and a lot of like personal bickering.
Do you think it's like necessary though? Because how many people actually listen to the local? I like the radio.
You'd be surprised how many people, and it's a certain type of person. I did not pursue a career in radio specifically at the time because it's not a growing sector, but it's very, very sticky for the people who listen to it. And like the folks, typically boomers, who listen to radio and that type of like hyper local media, they're very loyal. So they're very interactive on, I would say, boomer communications channels, writing in and email. And there's a lot of them. And I think it's also the media that is probably the most impactful because like there's probably 100 people having conversations about things in Bitcoin right now. But there's only 2 or 3 outlets in a city which are going to cover those like niche hyper-specific stories. So it's very cool to like talk about, this particular trash service like screwed up for the past year and didn't pay this other person or whatever. And then that becomes a whole story. And you're the only person with insight and reporting on it. Whereas if it's like a Bitcoin technical discussion, there's 18 different people, all with their own expertise takes. So it's more impactful in a very niche category. It's just like a little more, it's difficult to grow and expand your voice in that sector.
Do you reckon that radio is not going anywhere?
Ooh, that's a good question. I don't see it growing. I think I've been surprised how, I use the term sticky, just how like sticky and effective it is. I think it's one of the underutilized media right now. Just because all the media, it's very hard to monetize right now. Media's in a bit of an existential crisis. But radio has been really monetizable and has a very, very loyal listener base that I think will continue for some time. I just don't know if it makes sense to try to build a scalable media company. I haven't thought a lot about this. There's a guy in my hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma, who built, I believe, the second largest Bitcoin radio show.
Right.
Ordered out of our town. I helped him kind of bootstrap as a regular guest early on. And now it's nationally syndicated, called Cryptocurrency with Matthew J. Moore. And we kind of helped incubate this and guests out of our local Bitcoin meetup.
Yeah, it's funny. I wanted to do also a radio show about Bitcoin back in Chile, and I chatted to the owner of one of the biggest radio stations, and I was like, I asked him the same thing. What about how is radio going on? And he's like, think about it. Everybody's in their car listening to the radio. It's like inbuilt, you've got the channel right there. Maybe some people might be listening to music and that sort of stuff, but when you're in rush hour, you still want to listen to maybe some sort of accompanying voice.
And you can see this mirrored in the podcast phenomenon. Podcasts are the dominant auditory medium, but podcasts really just, they kind of replicate what already works on radio. Radio just happens to be a very proliferated medium, which is built into things. You say, podcasts allow you a little more on demand, pause, play, everything. But, there's something a little bit romantic about just turning on the radio, and it just happens.
Yeah, and I think there's also something about the radio voice, and the person that you hear on the radio that's got that radio voice is soothing, and it's got something that captures it.
I don't know how familiar you are with NPR as a Chilean, but NPR, it's a bit cliche. You have really smooth, muted tones, sultry voices.
Yeah. Christopher Lighting came to mind. Exactly. And I'm he's just a pleasure to listen to.
Yeah. So I thought about doing that. But yeah, spent a lot of time. I grew up, cut my teeth as a child listening to various programs on National Public Radio.
So what happened then in that transition to sort of after the radio, and then where did you go? Did you stay in media?
No. My family's spent half a century as building a small oil field market research firm. So it's a pretty specific, narrow range of expertise in how wells are drilled and completed, and the business of upstream oil and gas, specifically oil field services. So Charlie Spears Associates, kind of a pretty well-known independent market research company. I tried to study petroleum engineering, left to go to the business school. After college, I did a little project for my dad and my uncle at this small 10-person research company. Saw that this was a huge opportunity and took that independent, built a little data mining service, which I ran for almost a decade, from 2012 to 2020 or so. And that was my primary entrepreneurial activity. But meanwhile, I was very involved in Bitcoin as an enthusiast. So this is not media. This is more market research. Again, it scratches that curiosity itch. Similar kind of motivation behind it. Then 2017, I recognized a transition in Bitcoin mining specifically to begin to prioritize access to cheap energy. Because I have history and connections to oil and gas, and Oklahoma has a very opportunistic oil and gas industry, I was like, let's put Bitcoin mining on gas wells. And half a decade later, starts and stops, some wild successes and some frustrating failures, built a handful of sites that deploy some Bitcoin mines on the gas wells. And anyway, that was my official, I would say going from armchair enthusiast of Bitcoin to practitioner, operator in the field. And then a couple years ago, during the FTX bottom, if you remember that, sentiment bottom everywhere. It was not fun to be.
No, not at all. Yeah. Devastating times.
Bro, it sucked. And I was taking a couple months, just trying not to make any big decisions. And I stumbled into a Discord server with Casey Rodamore, who would then go on to release Ordinals. And because of my kind of natural engagement across Bitcoin and the broader crypto space, I just ended up kind of being the guy, the Ordinals guy, who's your token Bitcoin mining and Ordinals guy. Spending a year working for a mining pool, building some Ordinals stuff, and then a few months ago, joined my buddy Will Foxley to co-found the media company Blockspace Media. And so it's full circle. I just gave you kind of a quick crash course of started in media, full circle back into Bitcoin media. Never thought it would happen this way, and it's really fun. I enjoyed doing this way more than I do like having to operate Bitcoin mines. That's a very hard job.
It sounds super dry as well. Like, I don't know. I can't imagine, like, I think mining as an activity is really cool, but like actually operating the mines just sounds dry as fuck.
Yeah, well, it's because like in Bitcoin and crypto, like there's new ideas. There's a new narrative or a new topic you can research, a new thing you can explore every day. But in Bitcoin mining, it's about just your nose to the grindstone and honestly just responding to emergencies and problems all day. Things that are not really related to Bitcoin at all. They are operational challenges, such as I have this person showing up at this time and I have to have this permit by that time. And I have to have this electrician do this thing. None of these involve Bitcoin. None of this involves like new ideas. They're all just like, I've got these bills and invoices to pay and this infrastructure and this like zoning to hammer out. So like that, yeah, Bitcoin mining is more kind of like in any kind of like infrastructure industry than it is really anything to do with Bitcoin.
Going back to like going that full circle and thinking about like those early days at the radio, is anything like that you learned there that stuck that you're putting into practice or like approaching in a different way now that you're building up Blockspace?
I think I cut my teeth on being able to interview people with like limited context. Like, I mean, you know, this is like, we met last night randomly, and then, and like we were in the same industry, but like, you know, just being able to like jump right in and start asking questions to somebody and figure out if interesting content or sound bites pop out. That is a learned skill. And yeah, I think I just started practicing it pretty good then.
Yeah, it's something that I think about a lot, like asking good questions or like getting that conversation going. And like we were talking about before, like when you run into people that aren't as engaging or you have to sort of fish that that soundbite or that conversation out, that's when you got to really test yourself. And it's like, all right, how am I going to move this along?
Oh man, yeah. I smiled. I studied abroad in Spain for a little while, and I was not fluent in Spanish, but I learned it's kind of dumb and simple and cliche, but you just smile enough and eventually, and what you can't express in words, you can express in intention, and that often opens people up.
Have you ever thought about like going, or do you have the idea to at some point go in person? I don't know if like Will also lives in Oklahoma or
he's in Denver, Colorado. I think so. Are you asking like in-person content interviews media versus the virtual?
Yeah.
So I think both work. Virtual is a lot more lightweight. You can jump in and out. You can schedule things pretty quickly. I actually think with a little bit of work and some tech stuff, you can simulate like a pretty close like interaction as an in-person conversation, especially post-COVID. Everybody got used to talking on a camera, like video call, which did wonders for just the lightweight, like hop into a podcast and video call and like turn it into a podcast. I actually think that's fantastic. It's just for the time being, we're not going to be able to replicate the in-person dynamic. I like to have, I think both work. The funny thing is, you might know this, it's the latency dynamic and the audio quality. People are listening to that on a podcast, it's going to be very distracting.
Oh, 100%. That's like the main gripe that my editor has with me. It's like, come on, man. Because sometimes you just, things happen. The mic that you're using might be just old or screwed or whatever it is. And I feel like that's one of the biggest like punishes for me at the end of the day. It's like, well, not only that, but it's much nicer, much more dynamic to do it in person. But then you also have like those small logistical potential nightmares that can happen.
Oh yeah. When COVID happened, my wife and I are huge video gamers, and I was like, finally, we've lived in this virtual world for forever. Finally, everyone's going to join us. So I was like, okay, well, we're gonna spend a ton of money on like video setups, like mics, like whole like computer rigs. So we just got kitted out on our like home desk setups. And I think that served us very well because we're on camera all day. We're on these video calls, work and or otherwise. And so it was really easy for me to pivot that particular setup into this like now thing which I broadcast on the internet. Put out like I like live streams sometimes. I can host like podcast interviews pretty well. And it looks pretty good production quality for a guy who kind of just flipped the switch and just started doing that. But it's because I've always kind of operated that way. And I think I like to make this comparison. Like boomers say like, well, if you want to get a job, you just put on a suit, you go in, you give a firm handshake. And like, guys, that is like 1980s and 90s stuff. Like today, the millennial equivalent of that is presenting well online. Maybe it's a good camera, maybe it's good communication skills through typing. Like that is the suit and tie and firm handshake of our generation. So like that's, I think, it doesn't matter what you're wearing. I'm wearing a women's shirt. Cool ass like vintage women's shirt. But that doesn't matter. It's like how you come across online, which is the like that implicit trust.
How do you see, like, going along that, how do you see then the media industry as a whole sort of evolving, considering that the internet is like becoming the de facto media industry, or like the platform on which everything gets communicated?
So this is where my co-founder Will really shines, because our particular model is his idea, and I'm kind of sold on to it. He's a lot more versed in the overall media landscape because he thought about that. So as far as like making a profitable business in media, which is not a dying industry, it's just harder to monetize like traditional media. We're positioned more B2B. We want to, that's a more like sustainable revenue model to sell to businesses. And they don't want the same things that retail want. They want perhaps more analytics or industry experts. And they're willing to not, maybe like crypto in particular is very hype driven. So we don't have to be as like, what's the hot new thing? We can be a little more targeted and say, let's interview the researcher who's done this type of thing, and how might this apply to your business? So that's an angle. We can take a more industry voice. I don't know. I don't have a lot of insight, I think, to media broadly, except I just kind of parrot what my co-founder says, because he's had a lot of success doing this in traditional media and now crypto media. I do think the ability to wear many hats is increasingly important. So historically, media has been segmented. You've had the various hierarchical journalists to editors to chief editors to back office people, front of office people. But I think right now you've got to be a bit of a renaissance man. It helps if you can edit yourself if you need to. It helps if you to be able to self-produce everything, line up all your interviews. It's not required, but like it helps to be able to flex in all of those categories where that's not really been the case. I actually compare this almost to the music business, where like historically you just had to be a musician, look cool, and be a good songwriter. But now in order to be successful in music, you have to play the role of your own social media. You often self-produce everything as well as write all your music. That is, you are selling like a whole package which you deliver. I think media is probably really similar, and that's kind of why I try to flex and do all these different types of like skill sets. I have practitioner, I'm an operator in the mining space. I play the role of researcher and interviewer, and I can also self-produce everything. I'm not going to be the best at any one of those things, but I can kind of do that all together. And through that, we can build a pretty lean team of Blockspace Media, only technically 3 of us, probably never exceed 10.
Yeah, no, that's a brilliant angle. And I love the idea. And yeah, you never think about like the B2B side of things. It's always B2C. Yeah, and it's like, so how do I appeal to like an industry person or a company or this kind of stuff? But it's such an interesting concept of like research on one hand and then communicating the research on the other hand and sort of combining those two.
Yeah.
I feel like it's definitely, do you reckon are there any other companies that do something similar or any other?
You see this outside of Bitcoin and crypto. Again, my co-founder Will's, he's always sending me like, here's a company we should like. I'm like, cool. And I like try to research. I forget about it.
Yeah.
But there are some other B2B media companies. There's a really good one. There's this company, and he's going to kill me that I forgot the name. But they're like in aviation, and they put together this like physical and digital media, like a magazine that goes in all these like airports, and they have this little online component, and they kill it because they produce good like B2B media for the aviation industry, and they're able to monetize it because they have interest in some of the like sales of sites which turn into airports.
Okay.
I'm butchering exactly what that is, but you know what it is? Like they sell. They're kind of like a real estate company, which has a media top of funnel. I think that's a very compelling thing, which is the strategic partnerships. So we have the largest mining podcast. Bitcoin mining is now an infrastructure industry, large scale, $20 to $50 billion in gross revenue a year. We are top of mind and top of funnel for all things Bitcoin mining. It would make sense then. We're in close proximity to a lot of the deal flow in the space. So like that is a way we can monetize behind the media company how we participate. We haven't done a significant amount of it, but you can imagine like this extends across a lot of other type of crypto and Bitcoin deal flow. So yeah.
Are you good? I mean, I suppose, so right now your verticals are ordinals and then mining.
Yeah.
Do those combine in any, like, where's the intersection there?
So it's weird. I feel like I spent years developing an expertise in Bitcoin mining and like Bitcoin tech, never expecting them to link up, and they are fully intersectional with these two. Ordinals is downstream of how Bitcoin blocks are produced because it's really about how data gets onto Bitcoin. And this is a major theme in broader crypto, data blobs, through which we put roll-up data, other types of hashes, data availability is a big narrative. So since we just suddenly realized we could do this on Bitcoin, it becomes very important for how does this data interact with the Bitcoin ecosystem, and in particular get into Bitcoin blocks. Bitcoin blocks require Bitcoin miners to produce the valid hashes and then somebody to construct those blocks. And that is very, very impactful because not a lot of people in the mining industry, I would say, have an intimate understanding of Bitcoin block production. They know how to produce hash rate, different things. So Ordinals, while it appears to be mostly like JPEGs and stuff, it's a story of Bitcoin's data layer and different types of assets on Bitcoin which have to compete by fee rates to get into these blocks. So we have mining, Ordinals, and I would actually broaden Ordinals into like a Bitcoin tech category because there's a lot going on in the Bitcoin technical discourse. There is this soft fork proposal OpCat. And there's a lot of other things like that. And I think that's going to be an increasingly important narrative to have expertise on and to be able to communicate what's happening in Bitcoin technical discourse to the largely non-technical Bitcoin mining community. I don't know how familiar you are with the history of Bitcoin soft forks and hard forks, but there are all these Bitcoin stakeholders, of which miners are one of the largest important components. And all these people have to come to some kind of rough consensus about the state of Bitcoin and if we should or shouldn't soft fork. And Bitcoin miners for the past half decade have been largely divorced from this conversation, just because it's just a whole different side of the brain. And I think they're going to have to become more involved going forwards, re-familiarize themselves with how Bitcoin actually works. And Ordinals like kind of forced everybody's hand. It like forced everybody's hand to be like, oh shit, most people don't really know how Bitcoin works. A lot of these Bitcoin maxis have been just DCAing for forever, which is great. But they've not really used Bitcoin. They buy on a centralized exchange and they send to a wallet they self-custody, which is great. But they don't actually use Bitcoin. And because of that, they're pretty unfamiliar with the idiosyncrasies of like how the Bitcoin gets from A to B.
100%. Like the average Bitcoin maxi is just like Austrian economics and like philosophical side of things. But like in the nitty gritty they're completely lost.
Yeah, because like, great, you know you can explain hard money. That doesn't tell you how Bitcoin works. It gives you a good why for Bitcoin. It gives you a good justification for what I think is one dimension of what Bitcoin is. But it does not explain to you like how to set up a multi-sig or derivation paths or mempool relay policy. These are things which are like very important for this new post-Ordinals Bitcoin world. So yeah, and I think a lot of people, if you are familiar with like that chart of like, you know, you just enter something and it's like the knowledge or the confidence versus real knowledge chart, which is like you get in something you think you really, really, really know it. And
this is like the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah, Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
It's like people spend all this time learning about how to explain hard money and to like talk about macroeconomics. And so they said like, I've spent 1,000 hours doing this. And I'm like, and so they think that they know Bitcoin even more when in fact they've probably stagnated or not learned very few new things about Bitcoin in the last 900 of those 1,000 hours. They spent all that time learning how to talk about Bitcoin to a particular economic audience. And I'm like,
yeah,
like that's great. And it's become like the dominant voice in Bitcoin. And it's really distorted the conversation and distorted the knowledge of the user base.
How can we do though? But I completely agree.
Yeah.
But then the question is, how do we bring, sequencers or blobs or all that sort of stuff to like the average person that's like finds it interesting, but just immediately runs into that, and they're like, "What? How am I supposed to understand any of this?" You know, like it's a fascinating idea, and it's a fascinating like the software is amazing, and when you get into it, it's really cool. But then I feel like a lot of the times we get lost in that, like everyday users get super lost in that, you know, because it just gets so technical.
Does the average user need to know what a sequencer is? Do they need to know what a data blob is? No. The average user is never going to know those things, and it needs to be obfuscated. But for the industry who wants to build these things, they'll need to understand this because this is a very rapidly evolving discourse. Outside of Bitcoin and crypto land, I think there's a period of disillusionment, particularly in Ethereum. Of like, we've tried these things, we had this roll-up centric roadmap, and it doesn't seem to be playing out as we'd hoped. And a lot of those people looking at Bitcoin or Solana as very attractive. And I think this is probably just the natural progression of maybe blockchains. But I think that people thought we were way further along in the development of this new crypto world than we are, but I think we're still so young and immature. I don't even know. I think part of how we get to a more productive, proliferated state of some kind of crypto economic world is through just this rapid iteration in discourse. And so it means we have to be very technical. It means we have to like dive deep into obscurities such as sequencing and ask ourselves like, is this a solvable problem? Are we even looking at the problem correctly? And in the world of Bitcoin, there are not many media companies or even I would say, subject matter experts who can talk about those things. Because as we bring roll-up type activity to Bitcoin and everything else, you need to have the language and historical context to be able to like talk about what a roll-up is and how it fits into Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin world's got all the podcasts on Bitcoin are about like what the Fed's gonna do.
Yeah.
So like
they're adding dryness to the conversation.
Yeah.
It's just,
well, that audience loves it. It's great, but they're not positioned to talk about those types of things. Now, I don't think I'm actually even the best to do that, but I am very tenured in Bitcoin, and I think I have pretty good command over all the different parts of it. And I haven't had my head in the sand for the past 5 to 8 years. I've looked and participated in broader crypto, so I am positioned to be able to talk about it. So weirdly enough, like I started media, local news 10, 15 years ago, just through my natural curiosity and business activity, an obsession, spent a lot of time in the trenches in Bitcoin and crypto. And now I'm here surprisingly well positioned to talk about it and build content which focuses on that. So
what would you like to see more though? Like obviously aside from like, I don't know, people getting in the weeds, but let's say like, what do you think we're missing back to sort of the Bitcoin media side of things or the crypto media side of things? Like what do you think we're missing on that end? Because I think about that a lot, like how to communicate this kind of stuff. And I'm in the weeds, I work at the Defiant and we're like a crypto native media company, like
there's not a lot of those.
Yeah, we're like super niche and we're slowly expanding to cover other stuff, but we're like trying out the protocols, talking to the devs, that sort of stuff. Yeah. And I feel like you're saying, like in Bitcoin, it's all, the Fed and then the why, but that there's no like the how or the below the radar sort of thing.
Yeah, there's not a lot of companies which are independent, so they don't have a large parent company like a DCG or a Bullish, which owns CoinDesk. There's not a lot of, I would say, small independent media companies. There's not a lot of those. I don't think there's any which are Bitcoin native and tenured. Most media companies, including like the Defiant, has been looking at broader crypto. And so you're crypto native, but not as like connected and familiar with all of the different participants in Bitcoin. And the other component is Bitcoin mining. Like we, public miners sponsor our shows. We are personal friends with a lot of the C-suite folks in the space. There's not a lot of all those things put together. Like I look at the CoinDesk, right? They've been hiring a lot of traditional journalists to talk about crypto, and it's been somewhat effective, but it still stumbles sometimes because they might not have like language and context to talk about this thing. And then like I'll use like Blockworks, for example, like one of the huge success stories of last cycle. They've been mainly focused on like Web3 and in particular DeFi. But not as much Bitcoin. Like I'll listen to like maybe like Santiago or Jason, the Blockworks guys, like talk about Bitcoin, and I'm like listening to it. And I've been listening to their content for a long time as like my primary source of crypto information. And like I hear them talk about Bitcoin, I'm like, oh man, they
don't understand anything. Yeah. I mean, that might be a bit harsh, but because I used to be Bitcoin only, and then I shifted, and then and so I got super into like the technical side of things, how Bitcoin mining works, how Ordinals, I got super involved, all that sort of stuff. And I hear like journalists, editors, big media personalities talking about this kind of stuff with the most superficial understanding of what's going on. It's bizarre,
What's crazy is like there's been this narrative like, well, we cannot, Bitcoin is a dumb blockchain, we can't do these things on it. And I think people just took that soundbite and put it over here and said, let's go focus all our time on other crypto. And maybe that was productive, but at the same time, like Bitcoin has not had a soft fork, has not needed to have a soft fork to have all of these new things which are being built on it currently. People forget that 500 short days ago, it was consensus everywhere you could not put NFTs on Bitcoin. Within a few months of Ordinals, this was just brainfold. We just forgot that that was ever a thing. Then shortly after that, there's this rising narrative roll-ups on Bitcoin. Now I have BitVM and like compute challenge response on Bitcoin. None of these required a soft fork. It's just people just forget how open a lot of the design space still is. And with a potential soft fork on the horizon, this explodes a lot of the different things you can do. And I guess I think a lot of people had just let the Bitcoin side of their brain atrophy. It's all like, here, again, Jason or Santiago are watching this, love you guys, but I hear them try to like wrap their heads around like the Bitcoin UTXO model. I'm like, well, you don't know this like super well? That's, first of all, that's okay, but like, I just assumed you had all this knowledge so we could build upon how we analyze the broader DeFi ecosystem. And that's not the case.
Yeah.
So what I think crypto media, Bitcoin media specifically needs is familiarity with broader crypto, but from Bitcoin tenured voices. So people who have spent time learning about Bitcoin, not just learning the high level sound bites. Because I think we're going to find out that Bitcoin actually may have been the best blockchain the whole time. I think this is one of the realities that people said, well, Bitcoin is just this dumb thing, it's gold. But that's partly because the Bitcoin Maxis pigeonholed it to be just that thing. And it's not. It's so much more expressive, even though it's not the expressive blockchain. It's so much more. And I think a lot of people, especially a lot of the Ethereum people, are seeing Bitcoin as like, wow, maybe we should have been building on Bitcoin this whole time. It actually seems like it's like we've tried to iterate and fix these things on ETH, which seem intractable now, and maybe Bitcoin actually was the right decision. We have under the Blockspace Media, the Gwart Show. I think this is probably the best podcast in all of crypto. Gwart,
Bold statement.
I think it is. I'm gonna say that. I think it's the Gwart is he's
hilarious.
He's hilarious on and off Twitter, bro. So he's like he's sharp, he's witty, but he also drives forwards conversations with people in the crypto ecosystem, which are realistic. They're very reflective, and they produce both sound bites and long form content of like just exploring the what's and the whys with some of the people who've spent their entire careers building in crypto. And it's funny because Gwart consistently points to some of Bitcoin's simplicity and narrow definitions as like, maybe this actually was the right thing the whole time. I think Bitcoin Maxis have not been able to express those things because they've not been plugged in with the broader crypto ecosystem.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think that, I think that's one of the great things that Ordinals has been doing. Like it's such a Trojan horse at the end of the day. Like it's adding not even the expressiveness to the blockchain, but just conversations, like you say, that needed to be had, and like a return of, all right, we can start doing this in this much simpler blockchain, much simpler ecosystem, and get rid of the conversation. Or I mean, they can exist, I guess, but like the conversations that have dominated for so long are just, it's nice to see them like slowly become obsolete.
It's fresh.
Yeah.
It's so fresh. I felt there was a bit of like a wandering the desert period in Bitcoin post block size war, where it just it seemed like the fun conversations atrophied. What's funny is like we've had toxic Bitcoin maximalism for a long time, but the toxic Bitcoin maximalism of old felt very different. It was like actually pretty fun, and it was very intellectually honest. Where I feel the modern toxic maximalism, I was talking with Udi about this yesterday, from like 2019 onwards, has been very intellectually dishonest and also encouraged that espresso toxic maximalism to not really try to learn anything. the toxic maximalism of old would hold people's feet to the fire and say, you don't understand this blockchain. You like don't understand how Bitcoin actually works. And from there, they would have their biting, uncouth, politically incorrect criticism and voice. And I think it's very important to say it's toxic maximalism is not like you just saying like offensive things. It's actually saying offensive things to accomplish the purpose of like actually having a productive, intellectually honest conversation. That's where I think the main split was, because now to be in Bitcoin, you had to eat meat and go out in the sun and have a very narrow view on COVID. I'm like, those are fine opinions to have. That doesn't have anything to do with Bitcoin.
Yeah. How much do you think is the reliance on like groupthink on Twitter that's like driving a lot of these conversations? Because when you get in person and you talk to Bitcoiners, they're a lot more sane than what they give, like the general pervasive idea that comes off Twitter, you know, like those solar flares of just people just lashing out and talking about this kind of stuff. And I wonder how many people actually, like, is it just because of Twitter and how it amplifies a certain subset of people, or is it because, like, how important do you think we're relying on Twitter as a platform for these conversations?
So much of the discourse in our industry, more than any other type of industry, I think ever in human history, just is very dependent and downstream of the medium. If you look at, I would say some of the most productive discourse in Bitcoin was on Bitcoin Talk. This is a forum format where you have more long form, less high touch replies. And it allows people to type things out and have more like thought out responses. Also, while it was pseudonymous, the users were more known to each other just from a voice standpoint. And that's very important. The conversation that moved to Reddit primarily, which it was really hard because I found that a very confusing time. Reddit was interesting because it was a similar forum format, but because it would show the most popular content by default, that format enhanced like virality and viral communication, and not necessarily truth or productive discourse. Then Twitter began to be the medium in 2017, and that was interesting because it's just way shorter form, which means it's easier to just be reductive. In fact, it incentivizes.
Yeah, you have to be.
Yeah, incentivizes reductionism. But Twitter, on the other hand, allows just really interesting, more open conversation. It encourages. Twitter is comparatively more doxed, so people are more beholden to their statements as an individual, which I think is pretty important. Although I like the interplay between anonymous, pseudonymous, and doxed communication. But like Twitter's got a lot more like, I'm a real ass person. Like, you know, I live in Oklahoma. Like, I don't have my Bitcoin talker Reddit username. So that's important. It's just the Twitter, the movement to Twitter discourse plus the block size war made it very hard to not be reductive and hostile. So, but then you get in person and you realize all these people are just keyboard warriors. They're expressing their own personal issues by vector of some. They could have been literally anything. It just happened to be Bitcoin that they latched onto, and so this is now their thing. And so medium's very, very important, which is why I think podcasts are great. A lot of people think, well, everyone's a podcaster now, but I think that's great because like it's some of the best discourse.
Yeah.
I don't think it's bad that we have tons of podcasts, because especially our whole industry is about coming to consensus around complex, nuanced things.
Yeah, no, I agree. Not only because I have this new podcast.
Yeah, well, I have a the audience here.
Yeah, but I also think that like we need to be having those longer, extended conversations, and like I think about it as well as like a mainly written journalist, and so like. For example, the average reader will take about 35 seconds for every article, and you're spending, I don't know, like an hour, 2 hours, sometimes a full week. It depends. But I wonder how much that's also atrophied because of how Twitter has like forced us to do like these small chunks and small just, all right, you get this and then this and then this. And then like podcasting or longer conversations or even Twitter spaces just sort of like breaks that mold. And it's like, this is so necessary to create the conversations that we need to be having.
Yeah. And you look at, I would say hyper short form content like TikTok, which is it was really interesting to analyze because while TikTok it does condition the brain to have this like ADD attention problem, but TikTok has like been incredible from an just information standpoint. Like people have gotten incredibly good at communicating a lot in 15 seconds because when you add verbal plus written plus visual information all in one, square on your phone. I'm amazed at some of like the complex things people are able to communicate in these brief flashes of information. So it's a double-edged sword. It's made us so much better at communicating things really quickly, but it's conditioned us to only be able to communicate quickly. And yeah, so I don't know if you've looked at the data, but longer form content is not only coming back, but it's growing. It's not the majority of the market, I think, but it's some of the more monetizable content. So I think because like advertisers can wrap their heads around like I can sell ads into this. I know the audience. It's not an audience that's just necessarily going to be downstream with an algorithm on social media, but their audience, they have more analytics and insight to that. So
I wonder if it's going to be like a huge divide at the end of the day. And so you have like the vast majority of people on one side of the screen, just like these short form content, and then all the rest like doing these long form. Because I hadn't really thought about it that way, but because it kind of sounds counterintuitive when everybody is doing like short form content. But then, the long form one is what's driving so much more, whether that's attention, because naturally you have to spend more time on there and like more time, like minutes. Mm-hmm. But it also makes more sense to wrap your mind around it when you want to,
So you might notice one of the things we do is we have a lot of long form podcast content, but we have an editor and we're building out a editing team to be able to package those into clips and shorts. This is the meta right now. You have the meat of your content through these long form like mediums, and then you figure out how to package that into quick sound bites. Maybe it's a little bit longer, like 30 seconds to a minute, but that's still like really short form. And I think that barbell approach for media is going to be really effective. There's going to be a lot of things that are effective. I just think that barbell approach works really well. And when you do that, you can sell ads into both. So you can see like we have I think with CleanSpark mining company, they buy ads on our mining pod, and then we clip stuff, do a CleanSpark ad overlay with short form content, and that seems to be working pretty well. Those things occasionally get a ton of views. Don't ask me why one gets more views than the other, but it's a kind of a volume game.
Do you think that, like, tying it back in with media, do you think that that's the route that media is going to start to take? Because sometimes I wonder, like, we're just adopting stuff from traditional media into crypto media. Just it's in a different industry when people should be thinking about it. Like what you're saying makes total sense, and it's like, and it's so obvious when you say it, but nobody, like, it's only podcasters or small content creators or big content creators that are doing it. Do you think that that's like going to become the model also for maybe broader media, or like whether it's the Defiance or the Decrypts or are they just going to have like a vertical of now we have a new podcast and that's going to be part of it?
I don't know if I think that there is a clear model. My co-founder Will probably is more insightful to this. I think the model is probably downstream of the people operating it. because I was telling my dad, I referenced the family market research business. This is a old, half-century-old market research company, which has been pretty tightly knit and maintained top of mind for the industry for a long time, during multiple cycles in an aged dinosaur business. But about 15 years ago or so, the meta shifted from primary research of I go and I call a bunch of people in oil and gas and I assemble some charts in primary research and put that out there, to now the information is actually highly proliferated. And the reason people consume your stuff and pay you is because you're able to synthesize it and come up with coherent, actionable opinions on it. So I think that in this highly proliferated information economy where information is not scarce, and on a blockchain, the information is not just not scarce, it is totally public, and you can query the entirety of like all information from your node. Now the limitation becomes interpretation of that and being able for the individual to make actions and decisions from that. Because now, instead of having 3 decisions based upon well-researched information, we have infinite decisions based upon infinite information. So it becomes a game of being able to decide what to do. So I'm getting at that I don't know if the medium matters so much as the way you're expressing things. You're able to distill and take this fire hose of shit that happens in crypto and come up with like, here's a coherent narrative that you can follow. And sometimes I think this might be a little dicey to say, but like you can kind of create a narrative. And I don't think that's necessarily wrong, because sometimes you're the one who synthesizes the most. So the narrative I've identified this narrative and I'm going to talk about it. And then it kind of becomes a whole thing. Like I saw this happen in Ordinals a lot, where I was like, oh, there's this really interesting not obscure, but there's like interesting thing happening in Ord where you can do this thing, and I would give it a funny name, that technique, and it would become a whole thing on Twitter for like a couple weeks. People like launch collections. Like I would tweet something that, the tweet that would launch 1,000 collections, and it would be like that. And I think this is why we have influencer culture, because the influencers basically help people figure out what they should think. And I don't think this is necessarily bad. I think it just is incumbent upon the influencers and the analysts and the people behind the media to honestly communicate this and not try to be extractive or exploitative. I don't think there's actually a player meta. It's about how good you are at leveraging your insight.
Yeah, I don't think it's dicey at all. Like, I think people are sort of reticent to the idea of like either being an influencer or creating narratives. But we work in an industry that's so small, that's so like community driven, and like where you have these like small or like figureheads that do create the narrative, and that's just the reality, And I think, and it's interesting that you can also create a narrative. I don't know of another industry where you can create this sort of like, hey,
it's addicting.
Yeah,
kind of addicting because I'm like, this thing that I say could become a thing, and then it does. It's a little ego driving. My wife is the one who keeps me sane and grounded. Honestly, I get a lot of my cool ideas from her, so she's actually to credit. But yeah, it's very true.
Yeah. This has been awesome.
Yeah.
I always end on the same question, or it's 2 questions actually. It's related to books. I'm a huge reader, so I like to know what other people are reading and what they recommend and that sort of stuff. So I'd love to get what you're reading at the moment, whether you just finished it or just starting or something like that. And then what book do you usually recommend? It can be crypto related, or it can't be. Like, I don't know, maybe you love Dostoevsky, I don't know. But yeah, those are the 2 questions.
I do love Dostoevsky. My first viral YouTube video was a cover of a song, but themed about crime and punishment. It was weird.
No way.
Yeah, but it was famous because it was bad. What book have I last read? There's a book by Mark Goodwin. He's the editor-in-chief of Bitcoin Magazine, called The Bitcoin Dollar. and he's a bit of a conspiracy theorist, I would say. I love you, Mark, but it's a really good look into the business of stablecoins and dollarization and in the context of Bitcoin. I think it's really important as stablecoins become a very increasingly popular and core narrative to crypto. I think it's a very good gut check and should make us think about, are we just furthering the endeavors of the state? So I'd recommend that. A book that I often recommend to other people, it's one of my favorites, is I'm a huge fan of Hunter S. Thompson. Fear and Loathing. I dressed up. I don't know where my sunglasses are, but I got like the sunglasses.
Nice.
Just wearing those. So I love Fear and Loathing. I quote it all the time. It's funny. My wife and I were in Las Vegas a couple months ago, and I was like, "The monument to man's arrogance. Build a city in the desert and fly in fresh fish." So, yeah, I love Hunter S. Thompson. He really is the great American writer after Mark Twain. And then, yeah, so I would recommend it.
Nice, man. I'm an absurd Hunter S. Thompson fan. Yeah, I just gifted a good friend of mine Songs of the Doomed.
Yeah.
And just enjoy. That's all I have to say. Just handed it to him, like, enjoy. He's just amazing.
Yeah. Yep. So that's a good question. I love to ask people what their favorite book is. What's your favorite book? What would your recommended book be?
Fuck. I usually my favorite book is a book called Shantaram by Gregory David Roberts.
Okay.
It's a book. It's a fat book, like 700 pages, but it's a story of an Australian who escaped from prison and went to live in India. And then he tells you the story of tells you all the story of how he got out, but also gives you a dive into Indian culture in the way of like a international fugitive. And he's really poetic with words. And so he just like elaborates on scenes in such a way. And he touches in like really deep storylines on friends, enemies. He joins the mafia at one point. He goes to fight in Afghanistan with like the Bombay Mafia. It's unbelievable. Like, you know, when you run into those books that you feel like you're running into an old friend? Yeah. I get that with that book. And then I get that also with like, I don't know if you know Bill Bryson. He's like an American travel writer, but he's just super funny and super ironic. And yeah, being Chilean, that's like the kind of humor that I like heavily skewed towards. Yeah. So I also recommend that, like Down Under, which is a book of his travels to Australia, is just hilarious. But yeah, man, Charlie, thank you so much.
Yeah, real pleasure.
Yeah, it's been awesome.